Good morning, BookTube. Chelsea, the Reading Outlaw, here to do kind of a special video. Never really done a video like this before. Couple of things straight off the top. I'm sorry if I sound congested. I do think I'm starting to come down with a little bit of a cold, which is unfortunate, but is right on track with the seasonal change of the year. This is also going to be a really specific kind of deep dive into some data sets. So if that's not really your thing, or if that doesn't interest you, that's completely fine. I completely understand. Thank you for stopping by. Feel free to come back later. I would love to have you come see another video. Other than that, today we are going to talk about the recent Fansplaining survey that came out that is all about tropes and tone in fan fiction. For those of you who don't know, Fansplaining is a podcast where two women take a look at various aspects of fandom and fan culture and being a fan through various kind of academic and cultural critical lenses. They've talked about the Fans for Hillary fandom. They've talked about shipping and going to conventions and several different things. I'll have all the links down below. They recently put out a survey after kind of doing an informal poll on Twitter about the things that people love in their fanfiction. The ships that they prefer, the tones and tropes, and they got some results back and they posted their results and have done a couple podcasts and written up some really good articles kind of analyzing the data set that they got. This is going to be less about redigging into the same data set, although you can do that. I will provide links below to the raw data through Fansplaining. So if you want to mess around with it and run your own graphs and all of that, this is going to be more about my reactions, my qualitative reactions to the quantitative data that they found. So yeah, that's what we're doing today. Grab some popcorn, grab a drink, sit down. If you haven't seen the survey yet, please go take a look at it down below. I will post a link to the results that I'm specifically going to be talking about. There will also be several kind of graphs and visuals that pop up throughout the video. All of these came from that. All of this has been done by the lovely ladies at Fansplaining. This is 100% their work. I am simply reacting to it. Right off the top, some kind of disclaimers for the survey and just kind of talk about the methodology of the survey. They had 7,610 people respond, which is a pretty good-sized data set to pull from when it's a self-select survey and when you're talking about kind of a more niche market like the fanfiction market. It does skew heavily towards AO3. Archive of Our Own is a fanfiction site provider and aggregator and community alongside Wattpad and Tumblr and fanfiction.net and some other places available online. The overwhelming majority of these respondents get their fanfiction from AO3, which doesn't bother me. One, because that is a self-selection bias because I get all of my fanfiction through AO3, but also because the fansplaining ladies have done a really good job about being upfront with the fact that this set is not to be taken as purely representational data. There is a heavy skew in it. And along with that, and this is something we'll come back to later, there's also no demographic information. So none of this information reflects on the reader's race or ethnicity or gender or socioeconomic background or any of that. There was none of that information collected. One of the first things that the survey kind of asked about or talked about was shipping preferences. So shipping is essentially the relationships within any given fandom that you root for or that you prefer. And the general assumption about fandom is that it's just a lot of male-male relationships. And that's not entirely accurate. The survey actually found that while male-male / was the #1 preferred ship of choice, if you will, there really was not a huge difference between / relationships, heterosexual relationships or het ships, which is male-female, and fem / which is female-female pairings. All three of those together actually came really, really close together. You'll see in the graph that I'm going to pop up that a surprisingly large number of people read heterosexual fanfiction. And I say surprising because, again, this is coming from my lens, which is a lot of the people I know who read fanfiction read it to be corrective. They read it to kind of correct or adjust certain inefficiencies in diversity of representation. But then I started thinking about it. And I think this question is a little tricky because it asks about all pairings. It doesn't ask about primary pairings. So one of my primary pairings is Wolfstar. I'm a Wolfstar girl. I ship Sirius Black and Remus Lupin pretty hard. And so in those stories, there are frequently background characters like Lily and James who are dating. So that's a het ship. And it's there, and I read it, and I don't dislike it. But if you were to ask me what that fiction is about, I would have called it a piece of slash fiction. So it can get tricky, and there's some deeper thinking that I did not do in time for the survey that maybe I should have, that I've kind of since had the time to reflect on. The survey also found that 35% of responders don't read any genfic, which genfic is just like fiction without any kind of major relationship in it. It's not like about the ship. It's just, usually it's just stories about friendship or family members or various things, and there's no shipping in it. That actually seemed like really, really high to me. I was also sad to see that polyfiction or OT3s rated so low on the scale because that's my favorite. I love that OT3. You want Rex? I have them for you. Moving into the questions on tones, there were 144 options of the kinds of tropes and tones that people enjoyed in their fanfiction, and you had four options. You could self-select yay, as in I love to read that, nay, as in I never read that, meh, as in I don't really care to read that, but it doesn't really bother me, and IDK, meaning I don't actually know what this term means. Here's a picture of the most popular tropes, or the tropes that got the most kind of yay vote. I was surprised because it seems to me that the most angst-heavy tropes, things like pining and slow burn and enemies to lovers, rank way higher on my list than they are reflected in the major graph. A lot of the ones who are reflected here seem very, not fluffy, because that's not all that it is, but definitely seem to skew towards the fluffier end of the scale as opposed to the angst end. And for me, I think I had to stop and think about why that might be, or why angst tends to play such a heavy hand in the fiction that I read. And again, I think it goes back to the fact that a lot of the fiction I gravitate to is corrective and is playing with some of those original conflicts within the canon, and that tends to lead itself to angst. I also just think I'm one of those people that I like a little bit of tragedy before my characters get their happily ever after or their conclusion. I like things to be difficult. For me, the emotional payoff is more satisfying when we get to the fluff, if they've had to climb a couple of mountains to get there. So that is kind of what stuck out to me. I also don't care about canon in terms of like alternate universes or divergence from canon. For me, it's about the people, which we'll talk about again later, but definitely kind of echoes itself throughout the data set for me. I'm also very in line with all the tropes that people didn't like. Here are the least popular tropes. It's because these mostly deal with like really squicky consent things for me. And here's the thing. If you want to read about rape or incest, I have no judgment. So if that is your thing, this survey is not about judgment, it's about discovery. But I just noticed that in the things that I voted nay on most heavily, they tend to rate towards things that have to do with issues of consent, whether that's non-con or underage stuff, or even just in terms of like self with self, which is essentially where a character through either cloning or magic or somehow there's a clone of that person, and then the two clones of the same person get, like, that's just no. For me, that's just a no. The thing that I was surprised about is that there seems to be this, again, push towards the lighter end of the spectrum. Like, I love a good character death, but character death was one of the most reviled things in the survey, it turns out. It's the thing that most people do not like the most about their fanfiction is character death. And so before we move on, so that this video is not even longer than it already is, I wanted to take a second and to look at the most controversial tropes. Here's the graph. These are the ones that had the closest ratio of one yay to one nay. So literally people are pretty evenly split on it, and I think that it's really interesting. I think that it's interesting that DubCon is on the list as controversial, because I would have thought that things about dubious consent would have been pretty heavily in the nay column. But I think that I'm not expanding my view of what DubCon is. DubCon means dubious consent. So it's not non-con, which means no consent, which is rape, but it's dubious consent, which means like It could be rape, but it's in that dubious area. It's not quite clear that absolute explicit consent was given, and I just can't with that. So I'm always a little, as most people are, surprised when the general population doesn't self-select in the same way that I do. I also think it's really interesting that band and sports AUs are so controversial because, like, whatever. That to me is like one of those things where that seems like such an arbitrary AU to decide to play in that I don't understand why it's so controversial. I mean, I don't read sport. I mean, I have read sports AUs. Kay has given me some wonderful hockey sport AU fiction pieces, but I don't really. It surprises me that it's controversial. Like, I would have thought it would in general have been a meh, but apparently not. Apparently it is a really controversial thing. I guess it's really like a Marmite. You either love or hate sports AUs or band AUs. That just does not make sense to me personally. The last thing I think is really interesting is the pregnancy versus mpreg trope. So mpreg is literally when a man becomes pregnant. It usually takes place in the Omegaverse, where there are set societal roles for characters to fill, and those roles don't have anything to do with gender, meaning a man can become pregnant. This is something that, like, really mpreg made it onto the no/controversial list, and pregnancy was on the, like, meh list. It didn't really make any of the lists. Basically, people don't really care if their women characters get pregnant, but get super skeeved out if their male characters get pregnant. And I think that that is twofold. I think that there is societally this ingrained bias against the feminine spheres of life and femininity and things that indicate femininity, which include pregnancy. So when we see a guy get pregnant, it's too weird and it's too much, and it doesn't matter if it's already in a story where we've decided that the reason these characters have to be together and share a bed is because there's a tornado outside and there's only one hotel. Like, the levels of disbelief you have to suspend to get into fan fiction in certain cases are so large and so high that to draw the line at mpreg seems to me very much so like drawing the line at fantasy representation with no people of color. Like, elves and wizards, cool, black people, not here. So it's that same dichotomy, and it just doesn't ring to me. I also think it's because a lot of, and this is an assumption I'm making, which is that while not all, a large portion of people who read and write fan fiction are female. And there's this kind of interesting power play when it's a female writer creating a male character who can become pregnant. And I just think that sometimes that power play and that dynamic grates in the actual fiction itself. So it's just interesting. I don't really care about mpreg stories. The Omegaverse is like not, I don't even play there. That is one of the tropes that I just don't even go near, really. But I just think it's interesting that it's controversial specifically because it's mpreg and not just pregnancy in general. So we're gonna move along a little bit because this video is getting really long and talk a little bit about AUs and tone, and then I'm gonna wrap it up. So as I said earlier, I am a heavy character reader, and that applies to any fiction that I read. So I don't really care about your AU. I am here for your ship. I am a pan-trope shipper, meaning if you give me Wolfstar, or if you give me Stormpilot, or if you give me like a Harry Neville relationship, I will read that, and I don't necessarily care what the context is. Like, I have some contexts that I prefer more than others. I think a solid university AU in the Les Mis fandom makes so much sense that I'm surprised they're not all done that way. But there are also things that I will read that I'm like meh on normally, but if they have the ship that I love, I will be there for that. I don't know if that's the best thing. I think that there are some drawbacks about being so attached to characters that you're not willing to experiment beyond that and kind of shutting that down. But at the same time, fan fiction is like my safe reading space. So I don't police my fan fiction reading in the same way that I would necessarily kind of corral my outside reading. So I also don't care. I'm here for my ships regardless of the AU. But I do think that it's interesting that there's this kind of assumption in a negative context that all fan fiction is like coffee shop AUs, or like characters getting together in completely removed canon settings just to like have chats and be fluffy. And that's not at all what happens. As you can see from the graph that I'm putting up, coffee shop AUs are among the more popular ones, but they're really not the most popular. The most popular are canon divergent AUs, which is kind of like what Harry Potter and the Cursed Child did, where you literally take like one thing in the fandom, or in the canon, and you flip it, and then you kind of play out the ramifications of all of those things. So whether it's a gender flip or a race bend or an actual plot point that flips, there are things that then kind of get played out in a way that diverges from the canon, but still takes place in the same universe. And then you have like AUs that are just completely different, that are, you know, just literal completely different universes. And that doesn't even touch like crossover fiction, where you have two different fandoms that cross over, like Sherlock and Torchwood occasionally do, or like Firefly and Torchwood, or, you know, even crazier things like NCIS and Stargate, like crazy things that cross over. This survey didn't really touch on those, but I think that those crossover AUs can be really indicative of some themes that go between fandoms. So there's a really meaty intertextuality there that you can get into. But not all of them have that. And so I just think it's interesting to look at where the crossover AUs work really well and where they don't. And then when it comes to tone, I am surprised because I love PWP. PWP usually means porn without plot, or it can mean plot what plot, and it's usually literally just characters like getting together and having porn. Like this is not like a relationship where they have sex. Like literally these fics are usually not hugely long, and it's just boning. Usually I'm all about that. Usually that does not bother me. I am here for that. I did think that it was interesting that PWP placed where it placed in the bar graph, because I think the general idea of fandom is that it is heavily skewed towards PWP and stuff like that, and that it's all just ridiculous and fluff and sex crazed and all of those things. And while I myself may not be the best example of why that's not the case, it's not the case. But I think that what sticks out is that regardless of where you fall on this spectrum, whether you like angst or fluff or dark fic, which is like angst up like to 11, where literally like nothing good is happening. I don't do dark fic. I do angst. But whatever this is, your tonal choices, there will be really good and really bad examples within each of those tonal categories. So it's one of those things where, as opposed to your tropes, which are usually fairly described in the tags, and you can kind of decide on face value what sounds interesting to you and what does not. When it comes to your tone, you actually have to kind of do the reading. And so to get into the fluff or the angst or the PWP or the dark fic or whatever, you actually have to get into it and see how it's doing what it's doing. So I just think it's important that when you are looking at tone, that you perhaps are willing to be a little bit more flexible than you would be necessarily with your tropes. And that's it. This is a really long video, but that kind of wraps up my thoughts and my kind of deeper dive into some of the data collected by the Fansplaining survey. I think one of the best things about fanfiction is its intertextuality, and the fact that in order to kind of play in these sandboxes, if you're going to play in the sandbox and not just take the characters and go do whatever with them, there's an intertextuality there, and you have to understand how the story works and how the world works before you can break it apart and break it down and make something new with it. So while I think that fanfiction gets a lot of shit for being not important or just cast-offs or just safe spaces or whatever, these things that are kind of meant to be diminutive, I really think that they take a level of understanding and critique and engagement with a piece of work that you don't get in a lot of other venues. And I think that the fact that there were over 7,000 people who are willing to take the time to take this survey and think about the things that they really enjoyed in the fiction that they read, the fan fiction that they read and write, that is the beauty of what this community can do and what this community can offer, and why it's important to have these kinds of surveys. So we have the data that reflects, and we can start to make some conclusions about kind of a misunderstood and kind of nebulous group of people who all just really want to love and engage with the pieces of media that they enjoy the most. So yeah, let me know down below if you've read the survey, or after you read the survey, what your thoughts are. Please let me know down below what your relationship is with fandom, what you thought about this video, about the survey, all those things. Let me know what you're reading. I'll take questions, comments, concerns, all of those things down below. You will also find all my social media links, so feel free to come find me on the internet. We can talk books together. Until next time, happy reading. Bye.